Great morning, great afternoon, great evening, depending on where you are. As stated, I am Jasmine Ohanire, and I'm the Feed the Future team lead, and I am so thankful for the opportunity to give the opening remarks, um, or some remarks for this second iteration of this resilience assessment. Um, just in keeping in mind with this assessment, as we move forward, with this step number two, it really is taking us even steps closer to us creating new activities and designing our future Feed the Future Nigeria activities. Right now, we're in the process of developing our new global food security strategy. So in developing that country plan that we are working on, a lot of the information that we're receiving from this resilience assessment is going to really lead into how we look at resilience in Nigeria and how we create programming that can really create substantial change for the people of Nigeria. Keeping in mind all of the major negative effects that have created heightened insecurity. It could be the flooding that happened at the end of the year. It can be the consistent inflation in food, fuel, and inputs, especially fertilizer. It can be that recent change of currency, which has flipped everybody's life upside down. I myself personally have only seen the new currency on one occasion, and it has really been detrimental to a lot of our beneficiaries and a lot of the people who were really looking to help. And we need to create more programming that can mitigate some of these impacts, not after they happen, but maybe using a system that those impacts are reduced a little bit less and less. Because one thing is for certain, as we see in Nigeria, just with the list of things that I've just stated, there is always going to be some type of surprise, even though we think that things are going well. And with us using the tools that we use, like this assessment, it can help us in developing better programming. It can help us in making Nigeria a more resilient country. So I really thank you for this second iteration. A lot of the findings that I read in the report are very similar to what we're seeing, because we're also looking at this as we're working on our strategy, as I stated. And it's nice to see the consistency, but it would be even nicer for us to see some change. So I look forward to the presentation, and I hope everyone enjoys it as well. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jasmine. Really appreciate the welcoming remarks that you offered and putting this study really into the broader context, the situation in Northeast Nigeria, as well as your work, the mission's work to develop a new strategy. We really appreciate everyone's participation today and attention to the study. And our intent really to echo what you offered, Jasmine, is that it does provide the information that we all need to help with making strategic decisions and improving programming, so that we can better serve people on the ground who are facing those shocks and stresses that you outlined. So thank you for that. After this short introduction to the study, I'll pass the microphone over to Geeta Temsa. She's our lead quantitative analyst on the recurrent monitoring survey, who will present the methodology and the findings for this second round of the RMS for Nigeria. With that, I should also introduce myself. I'm Karen Fox. I'm on the study team with Tango International as well, helping to oversee the project and particularly the qualitative component of the study. So as Karina mentioned, we've allocated time for discussion and questions and answers. We'll have just a really brief moment for Q&A after Geeta's presentation of the findings. We have a lot of information to share, but it's really important that we allocate enough time to hear your perspectives and your insights, so that we can get a better sense of what these findings mean for programming and also for future research. So we've offered some guiding questions for you to consider, but we also invite you to offer your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the course of the presentation and during the Q&A. Or as Karina mentioned, feel free to raise a hand, turn on your camera. We'd like to see you and know you. Again, it would be wonderful to all be together in person, but in lieu of that, we're delighted we can have this session remotely, bringing together people from all different places. So we also, in addition to Gita, we have on our call today members of the Tango team, including our study leads, Mark Langworthy and Tim Frankenberger, quantitative specialist, Stephanie Martinek. And we also have Charles Meisch and Jessica Nwafor from our qualitative team. So all together, we're here as a resource to be able to respond to any questions you might have as we go through the presentation. We'll do our best to respond and keep that discussion open, and also intend to follow up after the presentation today with slides, as well as additional responses to those questions. I'd also like to mention that we have researchers with us today from our research partner in Nigeria, with whom we worked really closely to carry out the data collection from Binomial Optimist Limited, as well as Rural Resilience Activity, with whom we worked really closely throughout the last year in the design and implementation of the study, as well as a thank you to the Nigerian mission and the REAL Award and the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security for the support and critical input that you've provided throughout the course of this activity. So with that, we can skip to the next slide to offer just a brief recap on the overall study design and to situate this RMS in the context of the broader activity. Is the slide on? I'm only seeing the video.
Okay, so 1 second, we're having some technical things, but we'll get the presentation up. Just one moment.
Great, thank you, Karina. Again, I should mention, Karina, I don't know if you introduced yourself of the REAL activity, who's been extremely helpful in providing input and guidance to finalize deliverables and carry out this event as well. So as we wait for the slide to pop up, I just wanted to mention, in terms of the study design overall, it was someone from RRA who early on in our conversations, as we were thinking through the design for this, mentioned that, well, RRA and the resilience activities in the Northeast are really complex activities in complex settings. And that resonates. And it's really what has guided the thinking behind the overall study design for this activity in Northeast Nigeria. An area, as Jasmine mentioned, prone to recurrent shocks, insecurity, and high levels of displacement. So the study itself, really requires a flexible and iterative approach that matches the operational complexity of the project itself. So you can see we've got 3 different components on the right side of the slide. The first, back up, please. The first, an initial qualitative assessment we carried out not quite a year ago. And now this recurrent monitoring survey, which we initiated in August and will carry forward for about a year. As Karina mentioned, we're in the second phase of 4 data collection events over the course of the year. And then we'll subsequently start a deeper qualitative inquiry later in June. And all of these components really, again, speak to that iterative aspect of the study. So jumping ahead, I wanted to just highlight this slide that some of you may have seen in the presentation of the findings, the report of the findings. And here we've just mapped out the study activities together with the agricultural calendar, as well as some critical external events that Jasmine has mentioned. You also can see where we've situated this in recognition of the election cycle. In red, you'll see a trend line for inflation. So this is just an overview of how the study on the bottom row kind of fits into the larger context over the course of the life of this activity. And again, you'll have this to take a look at more closely after the event. So thank you again for your time. And with this, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Gita, to present the main findings of the second round of the recurrent monitoring survey. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon and good morning. Before we jump into the findings, we'd like to give a brief overview of the methodology As you all know, this study is comprised of a quantitative and a qualitative component. The quantitative component uses a panel multi-stage cluster design. We selected 34 clusters from a sampling frame comprised of 206 RRA communities. For round 2, our sample included households that responded in round 1 and consented to be recontacted. We did not have replacements for households that dropped out, i.e., in other words, round 2 non-responders. So essentially for round 1, we had a sample of 1,012 households, and round 2, we have 1,004 completed interviews. The survey tool for round 2 did not include a community questionnaire because typically we do not expect community level characteristics to change between rounds. It's a short period, 3 to 4 months. We also used a streamlined household questionnaire where we continue to track and measure the most important components of resilience based on what we identified to be key components in our round 1 analyses. So this includes measures of asset ownership, livelihood diversification, social capital, and information exposure, just to name a few. We also continue to track indicators that we expect to change over 3 months, for example, such as food security, food consumption, and of course, we continue to measure and track indicators related to the range of market services and improved business and production practices that RRA is targeting through its network of market actors. So that includes aspects of use of financial services, specific input market services, linkages to specific output market services, and then some select business and improved farming practices. And then one of the key changes between the survey tools is a change in the reference period from 12 to 3 months. The qualitative component uses a purposive sampling strategy, also a panel design. We selected 12 communities from among the quantitative sample, and the criteria we used was intended to ensure a mix of representation of the different value chains that RA is targeting, as well as communities that received cash transfers, and also with a mix of different displacement characteristics. This study alternates between a higher number of focus group discussions and key informant interviews in each of the 4 RMS rounds. So specifically for this round, we had 12 focus group discussions and 56 key informant interviews. Round 3 will have a higher number of focus group discussions and fewer key informant interviews. And participants included livestock producers, farmer households, agricultural input suppliers, VSLA members, financial service providers, as well as interviews with RA staff and government officials. The topical outlines were designed to complement the information collected in the quantitative survey tool. Data analysis for round 2 focused on statistical comparisons of key indicators between rounds, so specifically changes in food security, key drivers of resilience, as well as the use of targeted market services and production practices. We conducted additional analyses to identify the characteristics and behaviors of food secure households, what sets them apart from food insecure households. We were also interested in looking at the relationship between food security and the use of those services and practices that RA is targeting. We also looked at the relationship between information exposure on one hand and the use of targeted market services on the other, as well as adopted improved practices. And last, we looked at the characteristics of IDP households in the RRA areas. Throughout this process, we integrated the qualitative information to triangulate and contextualize survey results, and also to identify additional themes. And we interpreted our findings in light of contextual factors, the factors that Jasmine outlined earlier on, the impact of flooding, inflation, currency devaluation, the introduction of the new NAIRA notes, and general insecurity. Throughout this presentation, when we talk about change, we're specifically considering change to be any differences between rounds that are statistically significant at the 0.05 level. And from the onset, we want to acknowledge the challenge in interpreting these results with just 2 data points. It is difficult to tease out whether the changes in the indicator estimates are due to seasonality and differences in recall period, or whether they're related to resilience programming in the area. And so once we have a year's worth of data across 4 rounds, we can have a clearer picture of what is going on. We also want to caution interpretation of the bivariate results. These are correlations. They do not imply causation. They don't control for confounding factors, which could change the relationship. Moving on to food security. Round 2 coincided, as you all know, with what would have been in a typical seasonal calendar, the main harvest, and we would have expected food security to improve. But the impact of flooding combined with the low use of inputs contributed to lower than average harvest. And this is, many households experience consumption shortfalls also due to their eroding purchasing power and the fact that they had reduced income because of the lower than expected harvest. And this is reflected in our survey data. We see no change in food insecurity between rounds. More than 3/4 of households remained moderately to severely food insecure. And that is represented by the two topmost portions of each of the stacks. And our findings are consistent with what FuseNet predicted, which is essentially widespread crises and stress outcomes during the harvesting period. The figure to the right illustrates the distribution of households by incidence of food insecurity condition in order of increasing severity of food insecurity condition. Generally, we see no change with 2 exceptions. The first is that fewer households were scaling back their daily number of meals, and that's due to the temporary increase in food access because of the recent harvest. But we do note that more households cannot eat their preferred foods. That increased from 60 to 77%. The qualitative data showed it was consistent and showed households switching to less preferred and more readily available foods, such as homegrown items or items that are grown in the community rather than imported, processed, or store-bought foods. For example, in focus group, focus group discussants mentioned switching from eating rice or spaghetti to eating swallow, which is a cooked dough made from roots, tubers, and vegetables, as well as to eating maize chaff. We have our findings from the consumption module of the survey indicated less frequent consumption of certain food categories, such as oil, roots, tubers, vegetables, and milk and dairy, but on the other hand, showed an increase in consumption of fish, fruits, and pulses. The findings in the qualitative study indicated fish consumption increased, and this was because of the overlap with the fishing season in September and October. One focus group in Adamawa stated that fishing was exceptionally fruitful this last season due to the flooding. Moving over to shocks, coping strategies, and shock preparedness. The survey data indicate that the most common shocks and stresses continue to be price, weather, and disease related. The qualitative interviews underscore that food prices have not decreased as expected compared to previous years. We find similar findings from FuseNet that indicated the price of staple foods declined modestly due to the harvest, but remained very high. So as you can see, the figure to the right illustrates the topmost experienced shocks and stresses. We do see a decrease across these shocks, but they're highly prevalent. The decrease is probably related to the difference in the recall period, but the key takeaway here, again, is that price inflation continues to affect most households and prices remain high. The figure to the right here illustrates the topmost experienced weather and disease shocks and stresses. We note that, not surprisingly, the percentage of households reporting excessive rains and flooding increased from 43% to 58% between rounds. The qualitative interviews confirmed the widespread impact of flooding on farms. Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe were among the states most affected by flooding. We also note that most households continue to be affected by human disease. That's approximately 2/3 of households. We know that the country has been dealing with a cholera outbreak since January of 2022, and the flooding late last year contributed to an increase in water and vector-borne diseases, and the displacement of people from flooding to from flood-affected areas to unaffected areas also can contribute to the spread of disease. These survey data showed a decrease in the experience of theft or destruction of assets, as well as conflict over natural resources. We did not detect a statistically significant change in any community insecurity or violence or households experiencing displacement. There's a couple of reasons why perhaps our data illustrate lower than expected levels of conflict and theft. As we mentioned earlier, there's differences in recall period. Round one has a longer recall period than round two. So households are more likely to have experienced an event. Also, we know that the increase in kidnapping, banditry, and herder-farmer conflict is said to have occurred in the north central and northwestern states, so outside of the study area, and that the rising conflict occurred in localized areas in Borno. Even though the reported exposure to actual conflict in our survey data was low, the qualitative findings indicate that the risk of conflict and theft continues to impact the behaviors of households and businesses. For example, focus group discussants indicated the communities continue to experience kidnapping and theft. Farmers and businesses were apprehensive about traveling with large harvests or inventories of agricultural supplies from fear of robbery or kidnapping. There was frequent mention of theft of harvest from farms, and farmers also recounted conflict with herders around grazing, around livestock grazing crops that were ready for harvest. The qualitative data also indicated changes in displacement dynamics over the last 3 months, mainly as a result of the flooding, as well as insecurity and banditry in Zamfara and Katsina states, which created a new wave of IDPs. And there was also, it was noted that some IDPs were returning to their home communities due to a resettlement program that was pledging to help families build their homes if they were willing to return. In terms of top coping strategies, the key takeaway here is that households continue to use the same set of strategies to cope with a shock or a stress, and that's a combination of reducing their food consumption or diet quality, as well as borrowing food or money. If you look to the figure to the right illustrates the top most used coping strategies, generally no change, but a couple of changes that do stand out between round one and round two. The first is that the percentage of households dipping into their savings declined from 42% in round one to 12% in round two. This could potentially be due to the currency disruption, which made it difficult for households to access their savings. It could also have to do with the recall period, and as well as seasonal factors. Round one overlapped with the lean season, which would make sense for households to use their savings at that time, more likely to use their savings at that time compared to the harvest period. Another key takeaway here is the decline in the households diversifying their livelihoods. It's an important coping strategy, but we note that fewer households were taking up new or additional work. That declined from 35% in round one to 18% in round two. And again, here we think this could be potentially a result of the shorter recall period, but we also note the impact of flooding on livelihood activities in general. The focus group discussions and key informant interviews highlighted various strategies that households were using to cope with the impact of inflation. Notably, storing harvest and grain was widely reported in anticipation of future food shortages or the desire to sell again when prices rise. Households also reported defaulting on loan payments in order to cover their expenses or channeling money that they borrowed to make investments in their livelihoods into covering daily costs. Other households have been engaging in dry season farming as a way to recuperate losses from the flooding, shifting to different crops as well, short cycle, flood tolerant, as well as buying inputs and food on credit. In terms of shock preparedness and mitigation, there was no change in the fraction of households that are preparing for the impact of future shocks. That's approximately 2/3. The figure to the right illustrates the different types of strategies households used in round 1 compared to round 2. Key takeaway here is that there's an increase in households putting aside grains. That increased from 24 to 37% between rounds. There's also a doubling of households switching to different livestock. And again here, noteworthy that the percent of households diversifying their livelihood streams as a mitigation strategy also declined between rounds. Moving on to resilience, the first round of the RMS measured 3 aspects of household resilience: absorptive, adaptive, as well as transformative capacities. Based on the analysis that we performed in round 1, we identified key components of household resilience, and they are illustrated here. Very quickly, they include asset ownership, social capital, access to savings, livelihood diversification, and information exposure. In the next few slides, we'll be reviewing the findings around these key components of resilience to explore how they changed over time. The average score on the index of asset ownership decreased minimally from round 1 to round 2, as did the average number of livelihood activities. The figure to the left indicates the top sources of household food or income in rounds 1 and 2. Most households continue to engage in farming and crop production and integrate those activities with livestock production and wage labor. The key takeaway here is perhaps the decline in wage labor, agricultural wage labor, whether inside or outside of the village. Typically, we would expect that to increase in round 2 with the overlap with the harvesting period, but the flooding disrupted harvesting activities and disrupted market activities across the board, which can partially explain this decline we're seeing in agricultural wage labor. Moving on to social capital and collective action. The survey measured social capital by looking at the strength of the networks between households and their ability to support each other in times of need. And the key finding here is that despite economic hardship, the average score on the index of bonding and bridging social capital remained at moderate levels. Both approximately, the average score was 3 out of 6. We learned from the focus group discussions and key informant interviews that various local community groups and social networks come together to provide key services as well as provide financial assistance. But VSLA participants do report a large decline in the amount of money that members can contribute. And we also note a decline in the average score of collective actions, that is the types of activities that communities come together, for example, to conduct repair work. The qualitative interviews indicate that supply constraints and the cost of materials hampered community efforts to repair infrastructure that was damaged from the flooding. This next set of slides reviews use of market services and practices. There was no change in the percentage of households borrowing cash or borrowing agricultural inputs in kind or saving. But we do note that fewer households are borrowing from banks or receiving inputs in kind from market vendors. Instead, what we see is more households relying on friends and family to borrow cash or inputs. The qualitative interviews indicate that the demand for loans, bank loans, remains high, but it's become difficult for banks to issue new loans because of the volume of borrowers defaulting on loans and its impact and the impact that's having on reduced bank equity. The qualitative interviews also indicated that farmers were trying to move quickly to acquire seeds and inputs to replant and to recuperate losses. But rather than going to banks to seek credit because the bank approval process takes a long time and comes with high interest rates, households are opting to borrow inputs in kind from each other, from friends and family. Few farmers participated in describe participating in local microcredit schemes known as giving back during the harvest season. So as the quote to the right illustrates, some wealthy people give out loans known as bada kaka. They give a certain amount for you to pay for a bag with the crops. Irrespective of the value of a bag, at the time of the harvest, you must pay it back, as that is the term. Community credit and saving groups are important platform for savings and accessing loans. We note that the survey data indicated no change in membership and savings groups, which was a little over 10%, as well as no change in membership and credit groups, which was at 1% or less. The qualitative interviews indicated some VSLAs are seeing an increase in the numbers of members they have. However, savings members are describing a reduction in the amount that members are able to contribute. And this is resulting in difficulty in meeting the demand for loans and also the inability to extend loans to non-members. Participation in training was low in round 1, under 4%, and declined to even lower levels in round 2. It's worth noting here that the survey data was capturing participation in any training that the household received, regardless of the provider or donor. And it's also worth noting that direct training by RRA is limited, given the facilitative nature of market systems development approach that the program is taking. Some of the possible reasons for the decline in training between round 1 and round 2 may have to do with the shorter recall period in round 2 compared to round 1. Could also have to do with seasonality effects in that it makes more sense to have the training in the planting season. Also, we learned from the qualitative interviews that the inaccessibility of the roads that were damaged from flooding made it harder to get to training. There was also some reports of these quote unquote receiver mindset and that individuals were unwilling to participate in training without receiving the required inputs in order to benefit from the training. And the qualitative interviews also suggested that perhaps that the fact that farmer households were switching to crops that were not among those that are targeted value chains could potentially explain the decrease in the participation in training. Similar to our findings on training, we found that information exposure declined between rounds. The figure to the right illustrates the exposure to information related to agricultural production and market information. We see here again a decline in households accessing market prices or business and investment opportunities, as well as information related to improved production practices. And again here, could potentially put these in the context of the seasonal effects, that information perhaps is more useful in the planting stages. The qualitative data indicate that corroborate what we observed in the quantitative data, which is that the most common sources of information continue to be with members within the social network. So friends, relatives, then local markets, as well as traditional media. There was no change in the percentage of households operating a micro enterprise or small and medium agribusiness. So that was under 20%. But we do note that the participation in value chain production increased between rounds from 55% to 42%. We also observed that the percentage of households not cultivating crops more than doubled from about 7% to 16%. And we note that this was observed across the board for all of the targeted value chain commodity crops. No change was observed in the percentage of households raising livestock. In terms of input market services, our survey was tracking the use or linkages with the types of market services that RA is supporting, namely agricultural extension services, financial advisory services, business development services, and precision farming advisory services. And we note that the use of agricultural extension services and precision farming advisory services was low in round 1 and declined to even lower levels in round 2. Again, here this makes sense in the context of the seasonal calendar and that most trainings typically take place before or during the farming season. We also understand from the qualitative findings that it's important to put this in context of the difficulty of reaching agricultural extension services, both due to transportation costs and inaccessible roads from the flooding. Even though the demand is high, it is constrained by financial difficulties, as well as the lack of staff, extension staff and vehicles to reach communities. The use of veterinary or livestock services did not change. It remained at approximately 30%. Round 1 found that most households could access livestock services within a 5-kilometer radius year-round. So the impact of flooding on road access may have been less of an issue for those services. Among the different types of veterinary or livestock services that RA is supporting, only the use of animal health services declined between round, and this dovetails with the decline in livestock disease that was reported. We do note, however, that qualitative interviews with livestock input suppliers across all states frequently mention inflation as a challenge for acquiring products and supplying the needed services. In terms of output market linkages, we note that the key takeaway here is the decline in the use of contract farming from 16% to 4%, and an increase in the percentage of households selling their products through a trader, an agent, or a grain aggregator. The qualitative findings suggest that perhaps selling to traders and aggregators may have been more lucrative than contract farming. Some of the buyers are eager to purchase large quantities of harvested crops at any price in order to dispense of the old Naira notes. So that was one possible explanation that came out of the qualitative findings. Use of improved practices did not change, with a few exceptions, such as use of cropping systems, fertilizer application, and improved seeds. Again, here we know potential seasonality effects, as well as the impact of flooding and price inflation on the availability and affordability of fertilizer and improved seeds. The next few slides will wrap up with review the key findings from the bivariate analyses. In terms of the analyses on food secure households compared to food insecure households, we note that they differ in some significant ways in terms of aspects that are related to the key drivers of resilience, as well as in terms of the use of the types of services or practices that are associated with improved production and or income. Just to highlight a few examples, food secure households tend to accumulate more assets, they possess more significant social capital, they own or raise more livestock, they're more likely to receive critical information on weather and prices, and they're more likely to participate in certain input and output market services, as well as to use certain improved production practices. We do note here that, again, these are bivariate analyses, so we can't really say anything definitive about the direction of the causal relationship, whether it's the use of these services or the adoption of these practices are leading to better food security, or vice versa, that more food secure households, by virtue of possessing more assets or social capital, are able to take advantage improvements in the availability of market services and inputs. In terms of the relationship between information exposure and use of financial services, the bivariate analyses find that households that received information on opportunities for borrowing money were more likely to take out a cash loan or belong to a community credit or VSLA group. We also find that households that receive information on improved crop production practices were more likely to use agricultural extension services or precision farming advisory services. They're more likely to use contract farming, have linkages to transportation services, and they're also more likely to use some of the targeted improved practices, such as improved seeds. Similarly, we found that households that received information on livestock production practices were more likely to use some of the output market services that RA is targeting, specifically selling through an off-taker or linking up with transportation services. They're also more likely to use some of the targeted livestock services and to use as well improved livestock production practices. To wrap up with the last bucket of analyses, bivariate analyses we conducted on characteristics of IDP households, we found that IDP households were more likely to experience moderate to severe food insecurity. They're more likely to cope by migrating members away, reducing their consumption, using up assets and savings. But they're also more likely to use some of the more positive coping strategies, such as pivoting their business and production practices. We also find they're more likely to participate in training, as well as borrow inputs in kind and to use agricultural extension services. On the flip side, they're less likely to own assets. They have less social capital, and sometimes access to less. They're less likely to have access to information on market prices. The qualitative findings highlight the heterogeneity of IDPs in terms of their residents, their economic status, the resources they come to these communities with, and their ability to. Some have the ability to buy land, as well as the strength of their social networks. And with that, I turn it back over to Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. We could just flip to the next slide. We realize that is a lot of information to convey in a fairly short period of time, and we appreciate you kind of moving through this with us. We have the next couple of slides really just to step back a little bit and look at some of the key takeaways or conclusions from this second round of the RMS overall. So again, a couple of slides to just summarize the information that Geeta was able to share with us. And then we'll take a few moments to hear some of the questions or comments you may have on the findings themselves before we turn to the programmatic and research considerations of this research. Again, we want to hear from you about how these findings inform and can be informed by your experience on the ground. So in terms of conclusions, again, I think one of the key points that came across very clearly is that in the findings is that households are really grappling with a number of compound shocks and stresses. And this is, I'm sure, no surprise to you, Jasmine, you mentioned it. Our conversations with BOL and RRA have really highlighted the intense shock context that households are dealing with, some of the worst flooding in over a decade, price inflation, fuel hikes, high prices for inputs, coupled with just general insecurity. So it's a whole wave of shocks that, with flooding in particular, has prompted the movement of IDPs who are now sheltering in unaffected structures within communities or in other locations that aren't affected by flooding. The second key takeaway is that we're seeing that food insecurity remains high and is likely to persist over the coming months, if not to worsen. Primarily inflation, declining purchasing power are making it more difficult to acquire food and inputs. And what's interesting here is that food insecurity remained high despite the overlap with this main harvest for cereals and tubers. As Vita noted, more than 3/4 of all households are moderately to severely food insecure. Also, we're seeing hoarding, or I think perhaps more appropriately, and what some of our colleagues at AID have reminded us, really saving of grains and harvest in anticipation of future shortages, and in response to the real insecurity around prices and currency. We're also seeing that some households are becoming more vulnerable, or we expect that they'll become more vulnerable to future shocks as their ability to diversify income streams and food sources is reduced. Fewer households are mitigating the impact of future shocks by diversifying livelihoods, for example, by adding an agricultural activity or diversifying into a farming livelihood or non-agricultural activity. And we also see that participation in agricultural wage labor and value chain production has declined. As Vita discussed, we're seeing that access to finance is critical for securing productivity enhancing inputs and other investments in livelihood activities, but this is becoming more difficult. Fewer households are borrowing from banks or receiving inputs in kind from market vendors. And instead, more households are relying on friends and family to borrow cash or receive inputs. We're also kind of concluding here that sustaining the access to market services amidst this macroeconomic pressure is likely to remain a challenge going forward. The use of agricultural extension services and precision farming is low, and fewer households are applying fertilizer or using improved seeds. This may be, as Vita mentioned, due to seasonal effects, but the qualitative data have confirmed that inflation has really hindered farmers from acquiring inputs, and particularly seeds and fertilizer. We're also seeing that access to price, weather, and productivity information really fosters linkages to essential market services. But the findings show that households that receive information about where and how to borrow or to use improved production practices are more likely to take out loans, use output market services, or improve production practices. A number of indicators have been identified as those that contribute to improved household well-being, as Vita described in the closing section of the presentation. And the findings from these exploratory analyses suggest that food secure households are more likely than food insecure households to save, to accumulate assets, to use market services. And they also possess more social capital. They receive information on weather, prices, and business opportunities, and are more likely to prepare for shocks. Just one final comment around social capital on the slide previously shown is how important that is for the exchange of services and financial support during emergencies. But the findings also suggest that this is deteriorating in the face of shocks and stresses. I think something really to pay attention to, as some community groups are reporting that they no longer have the ability to help those sort of outside of their immediate groups. So with that, we just wanted to pause for a moment, open it up to questions. Feel free to enter those into the chat box or raise a hand. And just to hear your thoughts and reflections on the findings that we presented thus far.
So we have one unanswered question in the Google Doc, and that is there no room for tech-driven extension service delivery in these areas to drive penetration? And that is from Amoti.
Sorry, Karina, could you please repeat the question?
Yeah. Is there no room for tech-driven extension service delivery in these areas to drive penetration?
I don't know, Gita or Mark, do you have a thought to respond to that question?
Yes, I guess first thing I want to make sure I'm understanding the focus of the question. So the question is there a possibility for, I guess this means like phone-based extension services? Is that the intent here, to use the technology to extend messages through phone or other sort of communication technology? Is that the point? Is that what's being suggested here? If so, I think that I would say certainly there is the possibility for such a strategy. We don't have we do have information about sort of sources of information that people have received information, but I mean, I certainly think that that's an opportunity for investment in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And it looks like we also have some questions coming in from Jesse. Jesse, feel free to come off mute and ask your question, or I can read it out.
Yeah, thanks. I might word it a little differently off the Google Doc. I was really interested in what we know about what it looks like when these social relationships are under strain from just increased needs for loans and other kinds of support. Like what happens within the VSLAs or the social relationships? Are people just frustrated that they can't meet those needs, or does it really lead to like the collapse of certain social networks? And then I was similarly wondering, because I think that one of the toughest things that stuck out to me is the fact that there aren't the bank loans to meet people's needs, and then VSLAs and these other social relationships are just struggling in the face of mounting needs. So I was curious if any communities maybe had greater access to bank loans, and if social relationships in that context might be doing better. I mean, that might be too specific with the communities that you had selected, but yeah, basically those are kind of the dynamics I'm curious about.
Oh, thanks for that question, Jesse. I think it's critical. Just want to turn it over to Charles and possibly Gita for an immediate response. And I'm afraid, given the time that we have, it may not be fully satisfying, but I think we do have some findings in the data that could speak to that question. So Charles?
Sure, I can respond partially to that question. So that's an interesting question. We did not assess the exact difference between communities that did have the better access to bank loans compared to those that did not. I know that from our project data, we did have some interviews with financial services. We oftentimes noticed that banks, they expressed that they did not have the funds available to supply to meet the demand for their loans. And communities oftentimes express frustration with the process and the tedium of acquiring bank loans. Conversely, the SLA groups, some said that they were still able to see weekly membership dues due to it being harvesting season. But again, they do not have sufficient funds to supply farmers in the community with sufficient funds for purchase all their income, their inputs. I think this is, yeah, so I'll pass it over to Keita and Stephanie. So,
Thanks, Charles. I think I just said, it's a great question, and it's something we're keeping an eye out for, certainly in round 3. From the quantitative side, we can say that the social networks are holding up. They suggest that there hasn't been any change between rounds, but what we are learning from the qualitative interview is that these networks are coming under strain, and so we really have to wait and see what things look like in round 3. I think round 3 is going to be really telling on many levels. Over.
Thanks, Keita. And I see Mark's response in the chat box as well, that we plan to look at these factors more closely in the multivariate analysis that we'll be able to do after all 4 rounds of the data collection. I see a number of really great questions here and some hands up. We want to make sure we have some time to discuss the program implications for this, but with general consensus, I'd like to go ahead and take a couple more just general questions. From Jacqueline O'Connor, there's a question around the extent to which age, education level, or income impact these findings on training, participation, or access to information. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit in the program implications discussion, but Guido, would you like to respond just briefly?
Sorry,
Sure.
let me just jump in here,
Oh, sure.
Karen,
Thanks, Mark.
and say that my comment that's in the chat was in relation to those questions. I think that we definitely want to look at these characteristics of individuals and households and how those affect access to or participation in market activities and access to information. Those will definitely be issues that we will look at in the when we do the multivariate analyses, which we'll be doing after the collection of 4 rounds. One of the things I just wanted to say is that we don't really, for various reasons, one of them being just sort of time and resources, but also sort of seasonal factors, we avoid doing a lot of really in-depth multivariate analysis on the round by round data. We've found that it's better to just do that when we have a full year of data that captures seasonal variation, the range of variation, and that we can control for that. Over.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And I think you'll note from the presentation of findings, it couches in terms of food secure households in relation to less food secure households at this point. And I guess Geeta also highlighted these are somewhat exploratory analyses in the context of this second round of the RMS. So with that, thank you for your comment, Margarita. I still see your hands up, but let's go ahead and jump into a discussion around program implications. So again, this feeds off of or follows from the conclusions that we presented, and that we're really seeing in the findings that households are struggling to afford the basic needs, and particularly hard hit by the flooding, which, as mentioned, was more severe than has been experienced in some time. Altogether, that created an unexpected, perhaps, and real sudden demand for short cycle crop seeds for replanting as that water receded. And we saw this very clearly in the qualitative data. And that was coupled with a need for quick access to credit, which may not have been available through the formal financial sector. And as families were struggling across the area, limited the opportunity for inter-household exchange. So the question that we put to you, and again, you'll see it here on the slide in the box, feel free to take a moment just to think about it. But our question to you is, given the array of shocks and stresses that you're very intimately familiar with, and what we're seeing in the data, in light of that, some expected and some not so much. How can an activity that's intended to strengthen resilience capacities through markets, system services pivot to be able to respond to these changes, in particular, the demand for credit and inputs that we saw in this last round of the RMS? Again, that's our question to you. Take a moment to think it through. And then please feel free to raise a hand or pop a question into the chat box or the Google Doc. And Margarita, I see your hand still up. Perhaps you already have a response. If you'd like to unmute.
Thank you, Karen. First of all, thank you to the Tango team for this amazing work, and USAID for all the support. So my name is Margarita. I work as the chief party for RRA. Incredible findings. Before I provide you some programmatic response, I just want to say it's really interesting. We've done a series of different types of surveys, grain market, our annual surveys just concluded. A lot of what you're finding in the RMS in the second round tally with what we're finding. And at the end of the day, at the time that RRA was designed in 2019, these types of shocks repeated and more frequent could not have been predicted. So I'm happy to see that there's not a further decline in the indicators. So some of the things when you're talking about what market strengthening activities, for example, when we're looking at flooding, I know RRA is already preparing for the next flood. So we've been working closely with NIMET, and we're working with the National Emergency Management Agency. And we're going to put together a type of campaign that will look at what the predictions are in the types of crops. When we're talking about availability of inputs, I think it's really interesting to dig in deeper and look at those pivots. And that's what we intend to do. The types of crops that they may have pivoted to, which may not be to the food, to the taste of the consumers. I saw that folks had to eat more fruit and fish, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. To farm, for example, cowpea versus maize might even potentially be more nutritious and a better source of revenue for women as well. So we're intending from a programmatic perspective to dig in deeper within our networks and find out, in addition to the information that we have, what crops people pivoted to and why, and how input intensive they are, because I don't expect inflation rates to reduce, and we do expect more flooding shocks. I think for me, what is really interesting is social capital holding up, but straining. So what kind of targeting do we need to do to make sure that it doesn't buckle and backslide? So because social capital is obviously very important for us. So that's a kind of programming we'd be looking at. There's obviously a need to look at post-harvest handling much deeper, because if folks are storing grains to consume or to sell or to use, then we need to make sure that they have the adequate storage capacities and the knowledge. Jacqueline's question is really interesting about the education levels, and Omoti's question as well about the accessibility of information. I want to dig in deeper into who are the food secure households, what do they do, who do they employ, and what more can we learn from them, and how can we better target it as an MSD program, the vulnerable households. I was really pleased to see the business development services, especially being accessed by ITPs. We do believe that this is a key capacity, and I already have some programming ideas running in my head that I've jotted down on opportunities. We're very lucky. RRA is an adaptive program. Jasmine and Ayoade, our AORs, are here. They usually like a good idea, so we will present some ideas to them based on the information that we have found. Thank you.
Margarita, thanks so much. And I think you've sort of provided a framework for the next couple of slides that do focus on kind of the social capital component of the study, as well as what we can do to really promote and support collective activities around this. I see, Mark, you had a hand up as well. Did you want to respond to this before we shift into the next couple of slides? Keeping in mind, we have about 15 more minutes to discuss the programmatic and research implications before we close the session. And just a quick note with that in mind, we realize and appreciate, Margarita, you said you're making notes. I'd like to think of this as the beginning of our conversation. We realize a 90-minute session is a short period of time to discuss all of this and hear from you. So we welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation directly or in small group sessions going forward. So that, Mark, did you want to comment?
Well, just briefly, because I think we're going to get into it in the upcoming slides. But I think basically, both Jesse and then Margarita have raised the issue of social capital, and I think one of the things for us all to keep in mind is that we will have this in-depth inquiry coming up, and I think that these deeper questions about changes in social capital and social cohesion should be an important theme for that inquiry. And I think we also need to think, as I think the way Margarita said it, social capital is under strain. It's maintaining, but it's under increasing stress or strain. And I think we need to think about how we're going to sort of try and capture that as best we can, even in the next RMS round. Over.
Thank you, Mark. Right. And I'm glad that you brought up this deeper inquiry, the qualitative inquiry that just mentioned very briefly right up front. We recognize that some of these issues, we've got good qualitative or good quantitative information. And what we realize that some of these issues, particularly around the social network component and the collective action piece and the displacement dynamics, are really going to require kind of a deeper qualitative inquiry that is that reflects and builds on the quantitative data that we're collecting. So the information that you're offering and the perspectives that you all are sharing here, again, we're taking note and we'll work to integrate those types of questions into this deeper qualitative component that comes and kind of dovetails with the RMS. So again, we've already moved to the next slide, and I think, Mark, Margarita, and again, back to Jesse, your question sort of frames the questions that we came away with, given the findings and given the shocks and stresses and the increased cost of engaging in activities, how can our activities better bolster social networks going forward? And how can we then avoid undermining a return to more monetary transactions if and once things normalize? So again, just a moment. If again, we'd like to hear from you. I guess, Margarita, you said it better. How can we make sure social capital doesn't buckle? That's the question. And again, something we'll be digging into in the deeper qualitative inquiry, but would appreciate your thoughts and comments on that at this time.
I love your optimism that we're going to return to monetary transactions, Karen. I think we need to look at that. I think a different answer a different question to ask might be, how quickly can we bank people so that they can, so that the micro enterprises who've been severely hit by the demonetization strategy of the government of Nigeria don't continue to lose much needed income streams.
So again, rephrasing that question, return to monetary transactions once or if conditions normalize. I think that's a good point, Margarita. Thank you. And thanks for your comment, John, also around the importance of trust and relationships. I think we saw that in the data as well. Charles, would you like to just comment briefly on what we were seeing with regard to trust and social relations as people were found it necessary, for example, to default on loans?
Sure, I can say a few words on that. Let's see. So in the context of the environment where we're seeing households being hit by multiple shocks, first there was drought, then there was flooding, and then inflationary context, they're fairly strapped for cash and they did not see the return on the investment in terms of, they received oftentimes inputs on credit from either agricultural input suppliers or family or even loans from banks in a few rare cases. And then due to the flooding, they were unable to pay back the loans. And so some households have opted to default on them until at a later point when they hope to be able to amass some funds to repay, and they're prioritizing immediate expenditures such as food or medical expenses. In a few cases, in focus groups, especially in Adamawa, we have seen that households are oftentimes talking about tri-season farming. This seems to be something a lot of households have been talking about in terms of a way to recoup the loss of investment from this past farming season, and they hope to make some positive gains this next season. Similarly, from interviews with agricultural input suppliers, they are also fairly optimistic about the tri-season farming. In some cases, they know the people who they're borrowing from. So I think that really does say something about the social capital and trust element. That, for example, I don't remember where it was exactly, but one input supplier, he provided loans to a lot of the people that in his community that he knows that were family or sons of friends, and so he wasn't too concerned about receiving repayment, and so he felt he was still able to provide them with an additional inputs on credit, with the expectation that they would repay after this next dry season farming. So I'd be curious to see how this pans out in the next round. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. And I think this discussion also feeds into the next slide. If we could move ahead, and Tim, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in a situation where you have these multiple shocks hitting like this, and people, you're starting to see strains on the social capital. What we found in the study we did in Ethiopia in the Prime project was that when cash transfers were increased in those areas after 3 consecutive droughts, people were able to use the cash to reestablish and build back up the BSLAs, and the BSLAs actually helped contribute to increased social capital for those areas. So there is a way to kind of see how cash transfers in a situation where you've got really significant shocks being plaguing an area can be used to help strengthen some of the social capital that's needed to allow them to manage those shocks in the future. Over.
Well, thanks, Tim. And your comment brings up findings from that initial qualitative assessment we did as part of this study in April and May of last year, which again, different sample than the RMS, and with the intention to really ground our RMS questions and target participants in the study. But I think what it really highlighted, because it coincided with that COVID-19 cash transfer, and again, I don't want to speak for RRA on this, but we did see a lot in the qualitative data around the benefits of that in building trust and social relations. And now, after 2 rounds of the RMS with severe shocks, we're seeing that deteriorate to some extent. So it's an important point to keep in mind. And again, something I think we can dig into more deeply in the qualitative follow-on component to this. So shifting ahead to the next slide. And again, these are hard questions, so please feel free to give it some thought. Our contact information is provided in the slide deck. We, again, welcome to hear from you. But Pete, if you could just move it ahead to the final slide on programmatic considerations and questions. I think this also goes back, Mark, to the point you raised, that some of these questions will be more, will be better able to analyze after we have the full 4 rounds. But as we look to rounds 3 and 4 of the RMS and that qualitative inquiry, these are the kinds of questions that we are asking and would like to pose to you given the findings that we're seeing so far around the extent to which food secure households seem more likely to engage in the market system's strengthening activities, and why that may be, and how we can promote through our programming targeting the most vulnerable. So again, just a pause for a moment, and then over to you for any hands raised or questions in the chat box. Margarita, please.
So I think I answered this question much earlier, but on how we will adjust based on the information that we have been triangulating with our survey. I just really need to understand who the food secure are compared to who are not. And I think something that has struck me, Karen, about this is we need a further disaggregation on gender and youth. Perhaps if it is that the food insecure are women and youth-led households, then we need to figure out what will work for them. And possibly this could answer Omoti's question on the Digitech, the use of Digitech services, which we do already, and how we can adjust it. So how can an MSD program adjust its strategy to engage more vulnerable households in market systems is a big question that we've been looking at to increase resilience anyway. But I would like to see more of a, maybe in the third round, women and youth, and more focus on that.
Yep, no, good point, Margarita. Gita or Mark, any comment?
We can certainly disaggregate and look at female-headed households versus male-headed households in that regard, and also by the age of the household head. As you stated, it youth-led. So we can do that, Margarita, certainly.
Yeah, and I think we can also beef up the qualitative tools to try and capture those dimensions of age, gender and age as well. Yeah.
I mean, presently in the qualitative component, we have male and female focus groups, which, as Gita mentioned, will be ramping up in round 3 to provide us some disaggregated data by gender, as well as both male and female key informants. But I agree, Mark. I think we can, relook at the tools that we're using to really highlight that component for disaggregating the findings. And I just wanted to comment as well. I think one of the things that has been highlighted in our discussions and work with RRA are some of the kind of additional considerations for disaggregation. I know early on when we were carrying out the initial qualitative assessment, there was quite a bit of discussion around those impacted by conflict and displacement and the particular types of vulnerabilities that they face, whether they may be physical or trauma related. So I think that's also something that we will take a much closer look at in the qualitative deep dive. So as we are getting close to time, and the next set of slides that we have focus on considerations for future research. And I think a lot of what you have brought up during this discussion and in the questions refer to those research considerations as they are. And given the time we have, I'd like to open it up to just general questions or comments on the findings in the time we have, keeping in mind that you'll have the slide deck and the brief to be able to look more closely at the findings themselves. As she mentioned, feel free to unmute and open up your video.
Hey, Karen.
John, please.
Nice to see you. And great session this morning, really interesting stuff. And I appreciate the inputs from Margarita and RRA, et cetera. Just made it that much richer. Kind of a analytical question for you that I sort of hinted at in the feedback as well. So for something like that first bullet point, how do displaced populations differ from non-displaced populations, et cetera. Would you see it as outside of the scope of a study like this, or is it just a different orientation given? If that question was instead, to what extent are RRA approaches appropriate for displaced populations in the operational area, and particularly in their ability to engage in market transactions? So just kind of reorienting it to a more, kind of program evaluation perspective. Thanks.
No, thanks for that, John. And also for bringing it back to really the core research questions that we sort of moved through really quickly right up front, right? Which, the study has two main components, and one is to investigate and try to understand how these market systems interventions work in this context. But the second piece really focusing on what does that mean for people who have been displaced by insecurity and conflict in particular, but as we're also seeing by a whole array of shocks. So it's an excellent question that you raise, and again, it kind of brings us back to the core questions of this study. Again, I'd like to turn it over to the other members of the team and those in the audience. But just a couple of quick thoughts. One is that I think in part, the conversations and dialogue that we've maintained with RRA over the course of the study has really highlighted some of those characteristics of displaced populations. I think, and also contributed to the overall design of the study, which again focused on first a qualitative component where we really recruited folks who had been affected by displacement, and then coming back to that in the third component where we can dig into this much more deeply. That said, we've found, particularly in our qualitative component of the RMS, that we've been able to collect information and hear perspectives and experiences from people who have certainly been affected by displacement and may or may not be able to better engage with the market system strengthening activities. As Gita mentioned, and as it should be obvious that there's a great deal of homogeneity within those displaced populations, some of which moved with wealth and social connections and some that did not. So I think that part of what we can really do in this deeper dive is to sort of profile those different communities of displaced persons, where they're coming from, where they've come to, and how they're able to or not engage in these market transactions. Again, I know we're running out of time. I'll stop talking and turn it over to other members of the team who might want to respond to John's question.
Thanks, John. I think that's a good point. I guess one sort of a comment I guess I would have to follow up on that is that we are sort of interested particularly in looking at particularly the kind of market-based approaches of RRA, but I think we also have in mind sort of the larger question that was in that slide, because we're really interested to also help to inform sort of larger investment decisions about supporting markets, not just within the context of RRA, but more broadly. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Again, and I guess just by way of closing, John, I appreciate you bringing us back to those questions around displacement, and again, back to the overall design of the activity, where because of the nature of the RRA baseline and also the recommendation of the mission early on, that while we're using RRA as our focal activity, we want to take into account the array of resilience and market strengthening interventions in the region. So we're using, again, RRA to ground that in this context of displacement, but are looking at interventions more generally and how those do or don't or may contribute to strengthening resilience capacities. We are at time, so just very quickly, next steps. We will take all of the information and insights that you've offered and integrate that into the tools for the upcoming rounds of the RMS, rounds 3 and 4. Round 3 will kick off with data collection in early May, training just prior, and that is to accommodate the election cycle. And we're also planning for, as we've discussed, this deeper qualitative inquiry that we expect to kick off in June and use as an opportunity to really dig into a lot of the questions and issues you've raised here today. Thank you, Emily, for popping into the chat box a link to an evaluation. We appreciate your feedback, so please do take a moment. And with that, just again, want to thank everyone for their participation. We will be sending out the slides and documentation that we hope you find useful going forward. And those slides will include our contact information if you don't already have it, so that we can keep this dialogue going. So with that, thank you all for joining, and we're looking forward to seeing you again at the presentation of the round 3 findings, if not sooner.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.